Hey everybody, it's Susan Linder. I'm your host of the Innovation Storytellers show. Today we're going to take a walk down two very important paths. This seemingly disconnected, but actually incredibly connected path of cybersecurity and protecting the climate, protecting the environment, creating a more sustainable and safe world simultaneously. Now, it's very rare that these paths coincide with one another, so we think. But my guest today, John Shegerian, is going to tell us a little bit more about why we need to be aware of those paths and how he actually became one of the top innovators in this conjoined space. So, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's an honor and pleasure, Susan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so, I was really fascinated when I learned more about your background, because I think you're one of these entrepreneurs that is creating a profitable impact for companies that can actually make the world a better place. So you are the co-founder and executive chairman of ERI.
Right.
And you have paved the way for electronic recycling, data protection, and ITID industries as a whole, right? So tell us a little bit about how you built ERI and why you decided to build this company.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the why is always really fascinating when it comes to innovation, Susan. I had just come off of a successful .com that my partners, Mike and Matt O'Brien, and I co-founded called financialaid.com. So we got very lucky. And any innovator, any entrepreneur that doesn't give, the just due to luck, that luck plays in the whole process, is a little bit not being really real with themselves and their audience. So the truth is we got very lucky. It was the right time, right place for that industry to be disrupted and democratized. And we were in the process of selling it, financialaid.com. Numerous purchasers wanted to buy it. And I was introduced to this young man named Aaron Blum. And Aaron was the best friend since high school of my chief marketing officer at financialaid.com. And we were all sports geeks and nerds. And we were down in San Diego, and we would go to games together and hang out together. And he said he was starting a company to recycle electronics. And this is back in 2002. Kevin and I started following what he was doing, and we were intrigued by what he was doing. And we realized then that this was the dark side of the technological revolution, which was just at its precipice, about ready to take off. And none of the great innovators, Steve Jobs and all these wonderful, brilliant innovators, had ever considered what happens to those wonderful products they created to make our lives more connected, more enjoyable, both on a business and personal side when they came to their end of life. So Aaron started this little company down in Vista, California, and he was going along. And by the time we sold financialaid.com, which was 2 years after I had first met him, he had built a little business, but it was losing money every month. He was inundated with volume, and he approached us and said, "Hey, can you take what you did at financialaid.com and help me recreate my paradigm here?" And Kevin and I looked at each other. We met Aaron's investor, and we sat down, and on a napkin, a couple months later, we created what we call the napkin deal. And the napkin deal went to the lawyers and basically outlined our proposition. We were going to shut down the San Diego facility, move it to Fresno, rename the company, which is the name today, ERI. And we thought we'd really have a nice little California-based electronic waste recycling company. And why did we want to do this? Why? It was personal to us. Nobody wanted the environment. Nobody ever thinks about leaving an environment worse than you found it. We all want our children and our grandchildren to breathe cleaner air, drink cleaner water. Number two, it was very bad what was happening to electronics historically. Electronics have in them arsenic, beryllium, lead, cadmium, and mercury, and all sorts of other potentially hazardous materials in them. So historically, they were being dumped in landfills in the United States. Landfills have holes in their lining, and the landfills get rained on, and then these hazardous materials make their ways back into the ecosystem. And so we studied that we were polluting the environment tremendously by letting this stuff go in landfills. And if they weren't going to our landfills in the United States, we were shipping this to China We were shipping our trash to China or India or Africa. So we're being very bad neighbors to these, emerging economies. So we started studying it and we started doing this business together just in a small facility in Fresno, California, about 70,000 feet. And what we realized, when done responsibly and done correctly, it's a zero waste, zero landfill, zero emission business. So 100% of the commodities that you pull out of the electronics can be all resold to smelters for beneficial reuse. You don't create any water or air emissions when you're doing it right. And also nothing goes to a landfill. So the environment wins, you start also creating jobs, and you're not a bad neighbor anymore. So there's wins all around. And this was in 2004 when e-waste back then was the fastest growing solid waste stream in the world. Didn't get talked about, Susan, but it was the fastest growing. So if you want to make the biggest impact, the dream is always to make the biggest impact. As an innovator, we wanted to attack what was the fastest growing solid waste stream in the world. And we started the journey there, and it's been fascinating.
What was really intriguing for me is, like, we think of, when we're discarding our last phone, our laptop, the newest, Apple comes out with the newest thing, and we have to go out and get it that moment. But oftentimes we're completely oblivious,
right,
to our privacy and our data of what lives on in these, really the catacombs, right, of our digital lives over the last 30 years.
You're so right. And innovation by its nature, Susan, is also the mastery of a certain amount of humility to admit to yourself that you don't know everything and that you're willing to change as the times or the science or the trends dictate that change. So when we started this company, cybersecurity had nothing, first of all, it wasn't part of our lexicon in the United States or around the world. And data privacy and data protection also were not talked about on Bloomberg and CNBC or Wall Street Journal or New York Times. It just wasn't happening. But what we started listening to were the inklings of what we saw was the beginning of a trend. Palantir was created in Silicon Valley 2003, 2004. We saw the advent of LifeLock in 2007 and data privacy and personal privacy in Arizona with LifeLock. And we started messaging this issue that, wait a second, if Shreddit, we're going to use an example, made a fortune shredding data on paper, well, then who is going to be destroying the data and hardware? And we started talking about this in 2012 publicly. But Susan, we got massive pushback from others in our industry, and our clients all looked at us like we were green Martians until we got very lucky. I was at a cybersecurity conference in Manhattan in 2017, and I ran into the lead writer for cybersecurity for Fortune magazine. His name was Robert Hackett. And he said, I heard your comments today. I like what you said. Here's my card. Give me your card. Can I call you in a week? I said, absolutely. And then a week later, like he promised, he called me and he said, listen, I spoke to my editors and we're sort of in shock that we've never covered the hardware data perspective of cybersecurity. We've only focused on the software perspective. So we'd like to do a story on the hardware that's in old electronics and the danger that lurks within. So he did the story. It was a full page in Fortune magazine in 2017. It was called Dead But Not Forgotten. And the whole story covered the industry and e-waste as a whole and the problem of electronic waste. And his last sentence said, it turns out that electronic waste is not only an environmental hazard, but a cybersecurity one as well. And we took that article, both in electronic form and also in hard copy form, and we prosecuted that. We took it to every potential client. We took it to every potential media outlet. We took it to every client that existed and said, you see, this isn't us making up a story. This is a true problem that exists. And here are some of the most credible people on the planet, Fortune magazine and Robert Hackett, the lead writer on cybersecurity. And this is what he said about it. And we were off to the races. And true to form, it's become one of the major reasons that our clients and potential clients seek out not only our company, but a whole host of responsible recyclers in the United States and around the world.
And what a shift, right? This is why I tell people PR works, right? When you can get in front of a very influential journalist, it can be an absolute game changer, especially for innovators who really need help to get the story across in a larger context, in a way that's really accessible for people to understand and make relevant to their day-to-day business. Because I think most electronics manufacturers at that time weren't thinking about the ecological impacts of what they were doing, nor the cybersecurity implications of the data that was being left behind. But I do recall very distinctly the conversations around software. I remember whole sessions at, places like RSA and Black Hat. And I mean, there was always a little contingent of cybersecurity folk that were hanging around saying, but don't forget. And you're right, that conversation around hardware came much later than the conversation around software, because the ability for bugs to hang out in giant gaping holes in the software that hackers could walk through was pretty evident after a while. And software companies, to their credit, got better at it over time. But hardware was a much bigger bear to wrestle, don't you think?
And it still is.
Yeah,
and it still doesn't get a lot of media, comparatively speaking to all the massively multi-billion-dollar publicly traded cybersecurity software companies. The hardware side still doesn't get a lot of media. But to your point about PR, Susan, innovators are really deemed crazy until, just like that, they're not.
Right.
All of a sudden, if there's a switch flips with the outer world, the folks that were the naysayers, because of good public relations and sheer luck sometimes, and not all true.
Zeitgeist, right? I mean, there's a
100%
understanding the consequences of our actions. It takes time for us as slow-moving humans to connect all the dots. So what do you think in terms of, bringing these ideas to the fore, and, thankfully with the help of some talented writers of fortune, but what do you think is that persistent challenge as you see it? Tell us a little bit about what you bump up against when you try to talk to people about this convergence of eco and cyber together.
Again, well, first of all, let's go back to the issue of media and public relations and environment. If we're going to be really honest about it and have a frank discussion, and what I'm saying is there's no knock on anybody for this, but it's just the truth. The media has massively covered the last 17 or 18 years, two major stories: Elon Musk and Tesla when it comes to the environment, and the boogeyman of post-consumer waste plastic, and not much else. And so it doesn't leave a lot of airtime for other great stories when it comes to, for instance, recycling food, recycling clothing, two of the biggest volume producers on the planet that stuff off our landfills that are now being handled in much different ways, in much more responsible ways that make the world a greener and better place. The issue of e-waste. Yeah, I said 18 or 19 years ago when we got in this business, it was the fastest growing solid waste stream in the world. By the way, Susan, even though we exist and many other great responsible recyclers in the United States and around the world exist, it's the fastest growing solid waste stream now by an order of magnitude of 4 to 5 times over the second fastest growing solid waste stream, and it still gets no media attention. So the idea of resilience and grit and persistence in getting your story out can't be unrecognized. It's really critical because the media latches on to a Musk who is a larger than life human being, who's done tremendous things with Tesla and other great brands that he represents, SpaceX and other things, but they forget about the smaller, less flamboyant entrepreneurs or innovators, like to say, that are doing very impactful things that need to get recognized so they get more traction.
Yeah. So that bumping up, like media coverage is one thing, but what is the reception like when you go to a giant appliance retailer or a giant cell phone manufacturer and say, and are those the two biggest categories, or what are the categories we should be thinking of?
Yeah, well, it's great, really great question. And again, I always have to give luck its due. We hired a young lady out of college to be a saleswoman for us. Her name is Angie Ransom. She's still with us. And she was just cold calling. And so she landed on the brand that said, come on out to Prairie, Minnesota, and have a meeting with us. And this was in 2006. And we were this small little peanut of a brand, just trying to get some air and oxygen and get some revenue and profit going. And that company was Best Buy. And they said, what do you guys think we should be doing here? We said, well, why aren't you guys collecting? You're the largest retailer of electronics in the world. Why don't you also take back some of the old electronics when people are done with them? And they looked at us like, but you don't understand. In retailing, you don't give up the golden rules. You don't give up the precious space between our walls. We're supposed to be selling outwards. You're not supposed to be taking inwards. And so those conversations went on for a few months. And because they were so ahead of their time and really into the ESG and diversity and everything that we're now just getting its due in the mass media and with companies and with institutional investors, they said, let's give it a try. No harm in a try. You're in California. California is ahead of its time in terms of how they want to handle electronic waste. So why don't we start at 5 locations? We said, great. So we did a beta test with them for 5. That went to 10. That went to 50. Went to 100. Till went to every location. And it's one of the greatest success stories because when they were up fighting for their life back in 2012 and 13 against Amazon, one of the great advantages they had against their online competitors is that they had foot traffic coming in their store. And what they found is the millions upon millions of people that now go in all the Best Buy stores and drop off their old electronics, over 50% of them then go in the store and buy something new. So it became a huge advantage for them because they were so ahead of their time and they were always doing the right thing. So, and then once you get one to do the right thing, others start using that as their paradigm in their space, and other industries then follow. Staples followed, Costco followed, and so many other great retailers are doing the right thing in this space now. But that's over 18, 19 year period. But Best Buy was the first one in that space to step up, as were some OEMs as well. So OEMs, and then you have the retailers, then you have the waste companies, and there's a whole, and then cities. City of New York became a client back in 13, but in 2007, LA became one of our first big city clients. And now we have like 1,000 cities that are exclusively under contract because they want to do the right thing, not only environmentally, but they want to also protect the data of their citizens and their constituents. And they're also very concerned about that. So cities have been also very ahead of the curve as well.
So give us like some of the numbers around how this works. Like what percentage of, we know it's the biggest waste stream now, e-waste is just incredible considering how new.
Yeah.
And I'm still flabbergasted every time I get a paper straw inside of a plastic cup for my iced coffee, right? Like we are not putting these things together, people. Right. Like
and I'll give you the disconnect. So you're absolutely right. Okay. Although it's the fastest growing solid waste stream in the world because of the ubiquity of electronics, even since we started the company, on my finger, I wear my wedding ring as an Aura ring. It's an old piece of electronic when it comes to its end of life. My Garmin watch has a lithium-ion battery in it. I'm sitting here and, at my home, and most of our homes now, Ring, Alexa. We have our white goods also now have hard drives in them. So when our eggs and our milk runs out, it can basically order it, automatically from Whole Foods or some other local store and have it delivered to your house. So almost every
something I found on the web.
There you go.
Housekeeping.com.
Can I tell you, it's so funny. A girlfriend of mine, her 2 sons.
Refrigerated for 1 week tops.
Okay, Alexa, you can quiet down now. Thank you. And so
a girlfriend of mine, her 2 sons are both dating girls named Alexa and Siri. And the things are going off all the time when they're at a dinner table together.
And but the ubiquity of electronics has made our lives undeniably more interesting, more connected. It's improved education and healthcare and all these other great things. Here's the problem. Here's the sad facts, because you asked for the disconnect. according to the United Nations, and unfortunately, these numbers are about 5 years old, but they're the most recent numbers that are out there. Only about 17% of all the electronics that are sold and used on the planet, Susan, are currently being responsibly recycled when they come to their end of life. So again, innovators typically
What number?
17%, 17. So,
Yeah.
so innovators as a whole, my experience with innovators is that it's not the zero-sum game that entrepreneurs are typically painted with. Innovators typically work with the law of abundance on their mind, that the opportunities are almost limitless. So as I sit here and I share this story with you, and I'm so thankful for you having me on your podcast because I'm so excited about other innovators hearing about this industry, but I'm also excited about wannabe innovators in waiting and entrepreneurs in waiting that want to get involved in this industry. The delta of opportunity on a worldwide basis, Susan, is 83%. So although we exist as a company, and I have many great competitors in the United States and around the world who are just great friends, but also competitors in theory, the opportunity of 83% is unlimited to go get together. So it's a very sad stat, though, that in 2022, only 17% of all the electronics that we use, not just in the United States, around the world, are being responsibly recycled.
Yeah. And so that convergence, though, is how much of our data is getting hacked out of these devices?
A lot more than we want to admit. More, you see, what happens is, that's a great question, and those stats don't exist, but I'll give you the anecdotal evidence. So typically what happens is I'll go in and I'll bid on a contract and we won't win it. And I'll tell the people, hey, listen, who'd you choose? And they'll typically tell me, and I'm like, that's not a great choice. And I'm not saying that just you don't want to end up on the cover of the WSJ, the NYT. And almost all the time, 6 months, 2 months, it could be 2 years later, I get a phone call. We had a problem. It's not on the cover of the WSJ or the NYT. When could you be here? We need help. We thought we knew what we were doing. We don't. It's a very sophisticated part of the industry, and fewer than the world of responsible recycles on the environmental side is wide and large, and it's really exciting and it's growing. But on the data side, it's a smaller universe. It's very specific certifications and also skill sets, and it's a smaller universe. And unfortunately, people choose vendors off of websites that you and I know can be tricked up, and on false claims that we know aren't always reality-based. And they use vendors that are, in many times, doing the wrong thing. I'll give you an example. I am on the first floor of this office building in Fresno, California, currently. On the third floor is the FBI of the Central Valley of California. And it's not only FBI, it's also a division of Homeland Security. And they've come downstairs and spoken with us on numerous occasions. And they've said very clearly this to us. They said, John, back in 2001, 2, and 3, when people were buying our old electronics off our shores in China, Hong Kong, India, and Africa, they wanted to basically buy our old electronics and mine the copper, the gold, the silver, and the palladium out of them. Albeit they didn't have the right tools. They burned the plastic off the carcasses. The environment was messed up. And also they were probably using child labor in many instances. So there was human rights violations. All bad, but they were doing it to try to make money from mining basically the precious metals. They said, John, nowadays, us being the FBI, we've tracked now these containers going off of our shores. And on a large percentage of them, not 100%, but 30 to 40% of them are now being purchased by people who have adverse relationships to the Homeland Security of the United States of America. They're buying them not for the metals. They're buying them basically to pull the hard drives, to try to reverse the engineer any information they could get out of them. And then they toss the carcasses wherever they are, into landfills, into oceans, into deserts. And they said, this is what we're tracking. And this is what's very scary. So it's a data breach issue with the cyber criminals. And by the way, on a cyber criminal basis, Susan, we all grew up with the old adage by our parents telling us that crime doesn't pay. Well, on the cybercrime side, in 2015, $3 trillion was gotten away with the cyber criminals making away successfully with that. 6 years later, 2021, the number $6 trillion. So the problem is growing, although there's great software solutions and more hardware solutions, but the problem is growing. And it's not only growing in terms of them stealing from us or the organizations we work for, but it's also a homeland security issue, not only for the United States, but for the other great countries around the world that want to protect their safety and their democracies and the safety of their citizens. And it's a serious problem that I can't emphasize enough.
So, I mean, obviously there's a law enforcement issue, right? I mean, like we certainly can't even get our elected representatives to understand the breadth of the problem to actually take action on these things that we've been waiting for so long.
Yep.
And I think it's very fortuitous to have you on the show in the midst of this Twitter scandal that's going on, right? And
Right.
you know, not coincidentally, the whistleblower was my very first client working in a PR agency back in the day. And so it's amazing to see this confluence of now the world's top leaders, right, who use this platform on a daily basis to communicate their ideas, good, bad, or otherwise. But not to mention, oftentimes those very ubiquitous tweets, you know, are first wordsmithed and what have you on someone's phone. And there's lots of back and forth that happens between aides and third parties and whomever else to determine what's on that. And when that phone goes kaput, goes out the window, it's so easily discarded. And with it, potential breaches of security that we can't even yet fathom, right? That lives on that little device that has more computing power than the space shuttle.
It's so true. What you just said is so true.
This is becoming a national security issue of what lives on these devices.
Oh God, our family security, our children's security, our financial security, just as homeowners, but then every organization. So let's also think about what's happened since the pandemic. So March 2020, the pandemic happens and we all are sheltering in place and going home. The chief information security officers or CTOs or directors of IT of the organizations we all work for or work with send us some hardware to work from home with. And in the beginning, we're all here that we're only going to be home for 2 to 4 weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And so we're all trying to be careful. We're working on we're doing our personal electronics for our personal stuff and our business electronics for our business stuff. But human nature has then created this situation now. 2.5 years later, Susan, here's the biggest problem that organizations call me with on a regular basis. We all were working from home with all good intentions, and out of benign neglect or just out of human nature, we started making our Zoom calls for business with our personal devices and our business calls on our personal devices. So the word that's used in the industry is there was a cross-contamination. So now what happens is all the goodwill of the organizations that we work with and their client base are now on our personal devices, and vice versa. All of our personal information, our children's, our husbands and their spouses, and all of our personal information is on our business devices. So the level of how you have to treat now your personal devices and your business devices or organization you work for devices is literally has hit a higher hurdle post-pandemic because the information is melded. And we got to be really careful about that cross-contamination because nobody really wants to do the wrong thing for the group that they work with or group work for or their clients. And they don't want their clients' information to be benignly breached, which becomes a potential catastrophe because they traded in and traded up their cell phone at a local retailer, and the local retailer was very opaque on how they were handling those electronics. So the opaqueness of the industry is still real, and how the level of care that you have to give to all your old devices is higher than ever before.
Yeah. And I don't think we treat those devices as though it was a top secret security clearance of files that might show up in a Florida resort, let's say. We really need to figure out exactly where these devices, because we're so cavalier with, you know, a Facebook post just as equally as we are with something very secure like, oh, I don't know, our family documents, our wills, our what have you, right? Our stock portfolios that live there.
Susan, well-meaning human beings who are great public servants who work for three-letter agencies in DC, who are told save money, let's be careful with capital, and they go out to bid on how to handle their electronics, and they get a price from us, and then they get a price from Joe's Recycling in Maryland, and Joe's Recycling says, oh, there's no cost, I'll just come pick it up. There's no such thing as free recycling. When he picks it up, he's putting it into a container, he's shipping it off our shores. That's one bad outcome. Another bad outcome is they get a price from us and it's this high. Joe's Recycling gives them a price of this high. And then these well-meaning public servants who are just trying to save the government money says, you know what, forget that. And they put their electronics with government used electronics, and this is no joke, on Craigslist and eBay.
Oh
And
my
now
goodness.
and
Oh
this-
my goodness.
and
I'm
this-
having a heart attack.
But this is true. And it's not because they meant to do anything wrong. There's just a massive void of information out there on how to handle your old electronics and what dangers that could potentially lurk within if they're not appropriately and responsibly handled when they come to the end of life. This is just ongoing, real anecdotal information I'm sharing with you.
Yeah, it's intense. It's intense. So give us I mean, this is a show where we talk about innovation and the pace of change, the rate of change, what needs to change.
Yeah.
If you were speaking, and I don't know how much my audience of chief innovation officers, directors of innovation, product managers, product marketers who live in this ecosystem around the devices and just thinking about what lives in our homes and our pockets. But thinking about our audience here of innovators, what would you want them to begin to incorporate or think about in the context of the products that they're making now, or what they would even, thinking about policy around their employees of innovating how we think about data and the environment where all this stuff goes?
Well, here's the great news. Because ESG and circular economy are trends now, Susan, that are here to stay. And that's great because there's now, I'm old, I'm 59 and I'm older. And so the next generation, you and generations younger than you, are now coming on board, and they're going to be driving ESG and circular economy into our DNA, into our culture. What does that mean? That means it's time for finger pointing and blaming OEMs or retailers or consumers or politicians for messing up the environment, for climate change, are done. This is the time where all the stakeholders literally are going to work together and make the world a better place. And here's an example. We represent right now, we service about 80 OEMs, give or take a couple. So anywhere between 78 and 82 OEMs. And here's the great news. The OEMs have now heard the message. The consumers have voted with their pocketbook. And they're saying they want to buy new cell phones, new tablets, new electronics, whatever they are, that new gadgets. And they're constantly innovating. These OEMs are innovating, made out of more recycled material. So the OEMs have come to recyclers like us and many others and said, listen, we want to buy as much of the old recycled plastic and metals from you because we want to put it back into new gadgets, new materials to make our consumers happier. And we want to make our products out of 20%, 30%, 40%. It's a space race, literally, to make their products out of greener materials. And they're getting rewards from the government, and they're getting incentives from the government to do such. And they're getting incentivized by their own consumers who are voting with their pocketbook. And that's what's really starting to move the needle. And all the OEMs, this is not one or two of them, they're all in on this. And that's the great news. The world is changing as we speak, and it's changing for the better, albeit never fast enough, because we all want it to move faster. We all want the climate change issue to start calming down and the world to get healed up as an environment, but it's coming. And the next generations below me are going to make that change and keep driving it forward.
Yeah. So, I think every chief innovation officer is now aware that ESG is part and parcel of the discussion, whether or not we're getting all the way to policy and product manufacturing. on that level, it's certainly a consideration. I think the data portion is a much newer level of awareness. We're aware of cybersecurity in the instances that you describe. I mean, God, the level of laptops that were sent out, right, and loaded with corporate information and then loaded with user information simultaneously is unprecedented.
You're right.
And, it's amazing to see innovations in AI and things like that could magically populate and create packages and things like that would allow those laptops to function seamlessly, even, with all software platforms being uploaded remotely. But the risk level has just increased exponentially. So it's that second tier, I guess I would encourage our audience to think about too, in addition to your ESG goals, is thinking about your cyber goals and whether or not the products that you're manufacturing, if we're really tying up the loose ends on the other end. Well, John, this is just
That's a brilliant point, and I'm going to bring this up. How do we secure? You're so right, and there's an argument to be made that ESG really should be called ESGC, because if you don't cover your cybersecurity side, your company isn't sustainable. Your company is never going to be able to meet its diversity goals and all the other goals that come with ESG and your sustainability goals if it goes out of business because you have a breach that literally dissolves the goodwill of your company. This happens on a regular basis. These aren't just fairy tale stories. Companies go away because they can't withstand the destruction that a major ransom or cyber breach has created for them. So you're so right on ESG, cybersecurity, both on the hardware and the software side, becoming a real part of good ESG practices.
Yeah. So I want to take you down a journey that all of my guests go on.
Sure.
As innovators, we're always a little bit excited about what we see around us. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the greatest innovation in human history?
Oh, wow. Oh, boy. That's a hard one.
Or you could give us your top three. It doesn't have to be the
Yeah, definitely. I'm 59, so I've lived through what I've seen with the internet and the internet. I think that's been a tremendous innovation. I think also the ability, well, I don't know. I think some of the innovations that are the greatest, we're literally sitting on. I think, Susan, healthcare, for instance, and I'm not in that industry today, but I think the healthcare industry right now is about to be rebooted to the point where they call it the continual sunset. Allegedly, when you listen to the greatest minds on the planet right now, when it comes to healthcare and where we're going in terms of personalized medicine. So I think they say 15 years is if you can live another healthy 15 years right now in 2022, the next 15 years you can make it, you might be able to live another 100 years or at least 50 after that. And so I think organizations
get run over by a self-driving car, but otherwise, yeah.
True. No, you're right. So now think about how you factor in
to kill ourselves. It's fine.
Well, Susan, you're right. So then, wait a second. What happens to your mindset? So then, do you really play high school football or go into the NFL after that, or do you go with your best friends skydiving next weekend and take unnecessary risk when you know you can live another 150 years? All this stuff. So, who are some of my heroes? Of course, the obvious is the real breakthrough folks like Elon Musk, what he's created, not just once, but over and over, from PayPal to SpaceX to Tesla, etc. But then you also have the quiet geniuses, the Wojcicki sisters, and 23andMe, and what that's doing for personalized medicine and genetic testing and things like that. So to me, I'm just a geek on all innovators. And to me, to say one is better than the other, I think they're all moving the ball forward in a very important way. And I think AI and predictive analytics are also going to push forward not only healthcare, which is going to be unbelievably revolutionized the next 10 years, and we're right on top of it now, but also education, which we do have huge gaps between those who get really great educations and those who are left behind. And I think that leaving them behind those days are about to come to end in terms of the democratization of information and education as well. So I'm just so excited. I tell people all the time, people come to me all the time, people who want to be innovators and entrepreneurs say, oh, what do I do? Everything's been done. I'm like, are you nuts? Everything's been done. I wish I was 21 years old again. I wish I was 25 again. I mean, this is one of the most exciting times, if not the most exciting time to be alive in. So to be an innovator and to have an innovator's mindset right now is beyond exciting. I don't know how you can even sleep if you're 25 and an innovator.
Well, John, you are not only an innovator, but you're also a book author.
Ah,
So, as we conclude the show, I would just love you to share with people about this book that you've written around this topic with your co-founders.
yeah. And thank you, Susan, for that. I wrote this book, The Insecurity of Everything, with my co-founders of ERI and Aaron Blum, Kevin Dillon, Tammy Shegerian, my wife, and Brendan Egan. And the truth of the matter is we didn't write this to make money. We were very lucky. It became an Amazon bestseller in its space of cybersecurity and hardware hacking. But we wrote it just to share information, just for education purposes, because like I said, there's a massive void in the marketplace and innovation in cybersecurity, hardware, data protection. And so what I offer to you and to your listeners, Susan, is a free copy of this book. Anyone who wants to write to you and say, I'd like a copy of John Shegerian's free book or The Insecurity of Everything, I will happily mail them a free copy with no strings attached. They'll never hear from us. They'll never hear from salespeople. We just want to spread the word and spread the information so people learn how to make their home and their organization they work with or for safer and make the world a better place ultimately.
Fantastic. John Shegerian, thank you so much for joining me today on the Innovation Storyteller Show.
Honor and pleasure, Susan. Thanks so much and keep up the great work. I love what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Back at you.